I will draw from our experience in India. Before independence, almost 75 years ago, we were a country with massive rural poverty, years of famine, droughts, entire season without rain, majority of area rain-fed. We used to import food grains from USA. But situation was turned around in two phases. First phase, we introduced land reforms, land to tiller, removed landlords, and introduced new hybrid variety of seeds, and resources were mobilized to support farmers with focus on poor families. Second phase, which is more recent, if we take example of Gujarat, with three important steps, introduced scientific agriculture. Farmers were moved to select crop based on soil health analysis, crop that can be sustained by his land, supported by input of deficient nutrients, balanced nutrients, both chemical and organic manure. Second, massive water harvesting program, constructed 100,000 check dams. Check dams are very small dams. They are put on the rivulets. So every the water is stored, and constructed large number of ponds with micro irrigation program. Third, lab to land. Agri scientists visiting farmers at doorstep with village extension team guided them prior to crop season about selection of crops and solving their problems at the site. Agriculture got stabilized, sustainable growth of 3 to 4% per annum at country level. Poverty came down from 90% to 15%. Gujarat had minus agriculture growth prior to year 2000, developed 11% growth per annum. In the current arena of climate change, which got world attention with UNFCCC taking initiative as adverse climate event with intensity increase, India has maximum adverse impacts. I am not listing them, but we had everything: delayed rain, drought, cyclone, hot winds, hot weather, so on and so forth. But India adopted aggressive approach, promoted climate resilient agriculture with objective to build climate smart farmers and aimed doubling of their income. We developed guidelines for building climate smart farmers, made them available across the country. Farmers are reskilled, upskilled with focus on young and women farmers. India continued to have sustainable growth even with adversities of pandemic and adverse weather events more recently, and farmers have continued to increase their income. What are long-term perspective from Indian experience of past and present which can be adapted depending upon the local situation of a country? Structural reforms like land ownership to tillers, use of technology, hybrid seeds, climate resilient practices, soil and water testing, and based on that crop selection, climate resilient seed varieties, climate related weather advisories followed by agro advisories. Finance, funding to farmers with focus on poor farmers and funding to the rural families for entrepreneurship. Public leadership, initiative from top backed by both elected and non-elected members of public governance system with focus on poor families and agriculture. Now, some of the measures which we have taken are suggested here. Promote natural farming, diversify products, promote seaweeds in seawater. Seawater is available. India has a huge coastal line and seaweeds can be grown and they are useful for variety of purposes. Building farmer producers organization, water harvesting with micro irrigation, use of solar energy linked with linked with farmer can sell excess of energy which he produces after using for pumping to the electricity company and earns. But rooftop solar panels and bringing private sector in a big way on wasteland for setting up of solar. Big solar plants, use of bioenergy, biogas, manufacturing of briquettes from agro waste, and providing market infrastructure. Most particularly, build the farmers. In larger context, build society to become smart, to meet challenges with adaptation of solar and bioenergy, efficient use of water energy, learn to live with less. This requires initiative by public leadership at highest level. As in India, it is Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi who is leading all such initiative from frontline with strong with strong relationship and cooperation between central and state government, district to village level, involvement of public leadership, elected members of village council, people for farmers, farmers, government functionaries, civil society, all need to work together to achieve this. Now my favorite subject, advocacy for prioritizing agriculture. I will take 3 minutes on this and then finish within the time limit. The latest report, as Mark pointed out on global warming, IPCC 2022 highlight the increasing adverse impact of climate change. Apart from adverse weather, when continuing rise in temperature will further affect productivity in agriculture sector, food crops, yield from milch animals and fisheries catch and life. The key challenges to the world today and in immediate future are food security, food to hungry millions, food productivity, and need for maximum CO2 absorption. The attention of UNFCCC, both parties and non-party observers and organizations need to be focused on agriculture and farmers, as failure of above will have adverse impact on peaceful life of entire habitat. Agriculture with its photosynthesis process is only known technology absorbing CO2 from atmosphere and need to be promoted and used as a major mitigation tool. It must be realized that due to growing urbanization, massive and rapid increase in transportation and manufacturing activities, GHG emissions are going to be growing unabated. Only expansion on agriculture on moorlands, usable urban wastelands, growing seaweeds in sea can solve problems, and they will provide increased food availability, livelihood opportunities, reduce CO2 from atmosphere, and restore balance in nature. COP27 therefore need to come out with a clear agenda to support farmers and agriculture sector, and perhaps an action plan can be launched to include exchange bank for assimilating successful agriculture practices, technology, expertise from those who have it to those who need it. Prioritize agriculture and farmers and earmark resources for them by Green Fund, CTC, and World Bank, and conduct massive agriculture research for identifying plant species which can absorb maximum CO2. Global movement to bring wasteland and unused arable lands under agriculture, agroforestry, silvipastoral come animal husbandry development with use of bioenergy, solar energy, and encourage massive carbon sequestration and provide sustainable livelihood. Develop specific program which can be adopted by nations for restoration of agricultural land devastated by washing away in floods or eroded due to drought. Finally, my plea is remove discrimination against agriculture and farmers. Agriculture, vegetation absorbs CO2 and releases oxygen. Carbon credit is given to activities which reduce CO2, but agriculture and farmers are not given credit for absorption of CO2 by plants, by even horticulture plants in soil, in leaves, in stem and seeds, and in soil. Further, while calculating emission of GHG by manufacturing sector, only direct emission is counted. But what is not counted and added to their account is removal of agriculture or vegetation on land which they have set up their industry. And due to that reduction in absorption of CO2, and which has affected the nature's balance. While calculating GHG emission by agriculture, CO2 absorption into soil, stem, branches, leaf, fruit, seeds is not deducted. With this, I end my speech. Once again, I thank organizers to give me this opportunity to share my views. Jai Hind.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Kirit. That's excellent. Thank you for your presentation. I think we had some slight technical issues, so we weren't able to see your slides, but we were able to hear you very loud and clear. So thank you for your excellent insights. I'm going to pass directly over to Rachel now, and then if there are any questions of clarification for Kirit or Rachel, then I'll take those after Rachel's presentation. So passing over to you now, Rachel.
Great, thank you, Mark. Is able to hear me okay? Perhaps if you can just confirm that with a thumbs up, if I. Right, well, assuming all is well and that you can see my screen. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being in this session. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever it is you may be. I am Rachel Carmenta and I'm lecturer here at the University of East Anglia, also co-organiser of this event. And what I wanted to do in these 10 minutes is really sort of talk from my perspective, thinking about climate resilient development through the lens of tropical fire and highlighting some of the justice and equity considerations within that. So let me start off then by explaining why tropical fire is so central to climate resilient development. Well, you're likely aware of the increasing prevalence of more and more news coverage of it over recent years. And of course, the problem really sort of began in the 80s and 90s, but nevertheless is culminating somehow. We see fires in places that we would anticipate, California, Australia, but also increasingly also in places where we wouldn't necessarily expect. And so I'm talking now about the humid tropical forests, which over evolutionary time have been protected by their humidity. But now we see increasing fire return intervals at levels that are unprecedented in evolutionary time. And globally, this situation is anticipated to worsen. That's to say, wind speeds are increasing, temperatures are rising, humidity is falling. Climate change are really increasing the risk of megafire events. And that situation is determined or projected to continue into the future, really sort of flagging the importance of fire as one of the leading global environmental challenges of our time. And of course, fire is both driven by these climatic changes as well as other drivers, but is also a driver of itself, leading towards and contributing to climate change through the large emissions of carbon when forests burn. And these really are quite disproportionate, so contributing heavily to the carbon emissions of nations, and particularly tropical nations. And if we take, for example, Indonesia in 2015, the peatland fires, some work looked to sort of quantify that in terms of carbon and made the case and sort of showed that, in fact, the carbon emissions from those peatland fires over just a few months were equivalent to that of the entire US economy over a year. So that really gives a sense of the scale. But when you think about fire in the context of carbon and the burdens associated with carbon and climate change, but also to think about these multiple burdens accruing from fire. So impacts on health, public health of nations and of communities, as well as well-being. And when I'm talking about human well-being, I mean the material, subjective and relational dimensions of well-being, which are actually still quite poorly understood. And we're doing work now to try to quantify better the impact of flammability and well-being. Of course, biodiversity impacts are also acute, and there's a lot of natural science investment in quantifying that already, perhaps less so looking at the impacts then of biodiversity and forest has impacted. How is that influencing the nutritional diversity of forest communities? There's an interesting and unfortunate feedback loop there. Economic impacts are also high, and again, sort of across scales, reaching into the billions in 2015 for Indonesia's peatland fires, and that's not including all of the externalities that fall outside of those market analysis. Diplomatic tensions also come into play, and fire is a contested issue. So with that sort of context then, I wanted to extend to think about fire in the context of climate resilient development, and really sort of highlight and bring your attention to the capacity of fire to undermine CRD interventions and related interventions. And we did some work in looking at how undermines REDD+, for instance, and how it's really crucial to include fire governance in REDD+ initiatives. But those lessons in that paper extend also to thinking about fire's links in CRD broadly, as well as nature-based solutions, forest landscape restoration, all of which are sort of large-scale global interventions on the table for reaching these better pathways in terms of people, climate and nature. But I think a key point really to highlight here is that whilst we've made the case that fire is central to CRD and therefore governance of fire can improve CRD outcomes, doing so, that is to say introducing fire governance into CRD, it's really central and imperative to have justice at the centre of that. And the reason being is to avoid further marginalising those already most marginalised groups. I'm thinking about, and my work sort of speaks a lot to the rural communities, forest dependent communities, who of course are also those that are to these drivers of flammability. Yet they often get blamed or victims, you could call them victims really of some fire governance because of their association with fire-based agriculture. There's that intergenerational fire use has happened over time and has not encountered these mega fires that we see today. So in the next few slides then, I wanted to highlight some of the perverse outcomes of fire governance which doesn't have justice or equity at the centre. And the first one of those is this, this metaphor that we use, which is the rock and the hard place. And this was based on last year, where we showed that smallholder farmers in the forested tropics are under increasing pressure, or the rock, if you like, of the unfavourable policy context related to fire. That is to say, the prohibition of fire, the stigmatisation of fire use, all of which puts pressure on those forest users. And on the other hand, they're under pressure, or the hard place, if you like, which is the climate changes that are happening around them. And those conditions which actually can lead to more fire escape and fire invasion from external actors. So while smallholders are contending the rock and the hard place, they're also needing to use fire, small-scale fire in their agriculture, and they're on the front line when fires escape or invade from surrounding landscapes. So they're bearing the brunt of the material, the relational, the subjective burdens that flammability induces. Another perverse outcome is some work that we did looking at a PES scheme in Indonesia. It was sort of quite highly acclaimed for being a successful scheme because it reduced fire in a number of villages. And it did so through these 5 different components, one of which was a conditional cash reward. And then there was also some agricultural assistance and awareness raising. However, when we did some work to understand what of these factors were key in determining fire-free outcomes, it was actually none of those 5, and rather it was fear of sanction, which was introduced when proponents of the project brought police and army with them to introduce the project, reminding everybody of the illegality of fire. And it was the sanction that people were responding to. So again, raising questions around justice and equity. And finally, just to highlight that prohibition of fire can actually create riskier conditions and induce fire spread because of a sort of general sentiment towards secrecy, reducing communication around burns and fire management, and actually incentivising covert behaviours, which can then allow fires to escape. So if we consider those as some perverse outcomes of doing things perhaps suboptimally, then in fact, how can we better integrate fire governance into CRD with justice at the centre? And I've just a few slides and thoughts on this. So one of which is the imperative to distinguish fire types. This is work in the Brazilian Amazon showing a typology of fire. But you could extend that to other contexts. And of course, Indonesia also has a typology of fire associated with different actors. And each of those actor groups have different capacity, access to technology and resources to do things any differently, as well as a different set of incentives to manage fire differently. So recognising those traits is really important for fire governance in the context of CID. Then co-creating fire management solutions is an increasingly interesting area, especially thinking about optimizing across these imperatives that Mark has mentioned of mitigation, adaptation, development and conservation. And how can we do so by harnessing diverse knowledges and awareness of different technologies for fire management. And we see some good examples of this in Australia actually, and an increasing call to sort of open the scope for place-based knowledge to be integrated with expert knowledge. And one sort of interesting initiative in this direction is Fire Adapt, which is a new research funded by Marie Curie. And we are setting up an integrated fire management network, joining together 40 plus different institutions and actors with knowledge on fire, and thinking about how can we incorporate that into governance of these landscapes. And finally, so it was nice to hear Mark also talk about integration, because I think this is key to all actually of the environmental challenges, and fire governance in CRD is one of these examples. But there's clearly a very important need to integrate fire into CRD planning, into the future, in the context of projections of climate change, and opportunities to do so linking to other sectors. So, for instance, fire management in the context of health benefits, or fire and biodiversity gains, and bringing also, of course, the development dimension as well as carbon dimension into that. So really an integrated approach is essential. And those are some thoughts from me in the context of fire and CRD. Thank you so much for listening. Looking forward to the conversation that follows.
Super, thank you both very much. So I would just ask, just to let you know, you're competing with a very loud air conditioning unit, which is chilling us all to the bone, which is making it difficult to hear you. So if you could try and speak as loud as you can without shouting, then I think that would be helpful. But does anybody have any just questions of clarification for either Kirit or Rachel? But if not, that's fine, because I think we've got plenty of time now for our panel discussion. So if I could ask the panelists to come and join me on the screen.
Yeah, Mark, I have already joined Sadamatev.
So let me just introduce everybody first. Okay. So closest to me, we've got Santiago Alba-Corral, who is the director of IDRC's Climate Resilient Food Systems Programme and oversees research that seeks to promote sustainable agricultural productivity, animal health, nutrition, healthy food systems, and adaptive solutions to climate change. Santiago joined IDRC in 2017 as Associate Director of Food Security, and he was previously the Director of International Development at CARE in Canada. So welcome, Santiago. Next to Santiago, we have Professor Daniel Murdiyarso, who's the Principal Scientist for ICRAF CIFOR. He received his first degree in forestry in Indonesia, his PhD from the University of Reading, and his research focuses on related wetland ecology, land use change, biogeochemical cycles, climate change mitigation, and adaptation. Daniel is part of the Nobel Prize-winning IPCC and a member of the Indonesian Academy for Sciences. So welcome, Daniel. And then next, we've got Thuy Pham. This was the name I was most worried about. I hope that's okay. She's a senior scientist and team leader of the Climate Change, Energy and Low Carbon Development at CIFOR, and her research focuses on the political economy of forest governance and climate change policies. She has led and coordinated global climate change research and established a strong global professional network with global research institutes covering 17 developing countries. And then next to her, we have Dr. Margaret Angula, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Namibia. She has over 20 years research experience in environmental management and sustainable livelihoods with a specialism in gender and climate change, as well as climate resilient development and capacity building. She has been a project coordinator for international and multi-institutional projects on climate change adaptation since 2014. Welcome, Margaret. Lovely to see you again. And then we have Imelda Bacudo, who is a senior advisor to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations to support the transformation of ASEAN to low emissions and resilient agri-food sector. She's been instrumental in guiding the ASEAN Climate Resilient Network, a platform for knowledge exchange and support on climate smart land use to help push the agricultural sector into greater engagement with UNFCCC. So a really excellent and diverse panel. So thank you all for participating. And then we've got one more person online who is Vishwanath Sadamatev, who's an agricultural extension specialist and former agricultural advisor to the Planning Commission of the Government of India. He's worked with ICAR and the Ministry of Agriculture in various capacities before joining the Planning Commission as an advisor on agriculture. He's also worked as a principal consultant with FAO and was associated with numerous World Bank-assisted watershed management projects. So very warm welcome to you, Vishwanath, as well. Very glad that you could join us virtually. So I think...
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. For the first question, I mean, rather than a question, and I'm going to start with you, Vishwanath, if you could just comment on some of the key ways in which you think climate and development are linked in the context that you are speaking from, so drawing on your own experience and the ways in which you think that climate change is impacted by development and vice versa. So I'll come to you first, Vishwanath, and then I'll come to the panel in the room.
Okay, am I audible, Mark?
Yeah, we can hear you, but if you could speak as loud as possible, because you are fighting the AC.
Thank you, Mark, and Dr. Shelat, for giving me this wonderful opportunity. I have a couple of submissions on the questions that you have indicated for the panelists. The first one, what you mentioned was, what are the truly transformative actions for the adaptation and mitigation on climate change? My response to that question would be, technology demonstration can be one element. Number two can be empowered stakeholders. Number three can be streamlining delivery mechanism of climate smart technologies. And the next in that order can be a pilot projects on climate smart interventions at the community level or at the farmers level. And last one, the transformative action could be micro ecosystem balance at the local level. I'll just take a few more minutes, and there was another very interesting question which I liked very much. Is what are the key research and knowledge areas that we should focus when we talk about adaptation, mitigation, etc. I have a couple of submissions on the future areas for climate action research. Number one could be the R&D, research and development linkages, or how they should be made effective at, let us say, a district level or at a county level or at a group of village, what you call it as a circle or a cluster level. Number two, can we think of taking or selecting some climate resilient interventions and see how the different categories of the farmers respond to that, number one, how the community actions could be initiated to absorb those climate resilient interventions. And number three could be, what kind of public policies and support mechanisms we should have, for promoting climate resilient, development. At the same time, I would also propose one more area for action research on climate change. It could be, feedback received from, various categories of the farmers, farm women, farm youth, farmer community across the production system. It can be crops, it can be animal, it can be dairy, it can be fishery, poultry, etc. Analyze that response. Maybe the University of East Anglia and then National Council for Climate Change can think of a joint pilot, for getting a feedback, analyzing the feedback, documenting it, and giving signal to the research management, giving signal to the policy makers, and giving signal, to the implementers at the grassroots level. Another, very important, research area, challenging research area would be.
Vishwanath, sorry to
I
interrupt.
just takes a minute. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to stop there, just because I'm aware that
Okay.
we've got a number of other people on the panel, so just to give them an opportunity to respond, and then with the other questions that we have either from me or the audience, we'll come back to you. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
So
Thanks for the opportunity.
if I start with you now, Santiago.
Yeah, I think instead of giving some specific examples, I want to address how actually the climate crisis is affecting everything that we in the development agenda. And I think that actually when less than 2 years ago, IDRC looked at our new strategic plan that aligned to a 2030 agenda, we put climate and the climate crisis as one of the critical challenges that will affect everything that we do. And I think that is critical on the conversation that on the pathways that we have seen that have been presented today, is that at some point will not be a development agenda that is not climate resilience, because the reality of the climate crisis will make necessary that change. In particular, for instance, when we look at our vision for a climate resilient food systems program, where we have identified that all the work that we do around sustainable production systems, or that are amplified in the development impacts by inclusive and healthy food systems, for instance, there will be a traditional pathway of development. Those two elements that go hand in hand, the production systems, the access to markets, the sustainable ways of reaching animal production, of crop productions, and the policies, environments of healthy foods, all of them are at risk if we don't create a strong adaptation and resilient capacity of the communities that are going to benefit for those systems. So for us, that connection needs to happen even in the research that we do, because IDRC is not only the development agenda, it's a research for development agenda, because we will not be providing the solutions that smallholder farmers, that women, that policymakers need if those solutions are not resilient to climate change. Otherwise, they will be no useful. And I want to stop here to give others.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Daniel.
Me? Okay, so I think the nexus between mitigation and adaptation is very, very important to bridge, especially when development is coming to the agenda, because both of them are affected and affecting development. So I've been working in very fragile ecosystem called mangrove and in the coastal zone. And you can imagine this ecosystem is quite maybe candidate or champion in the context of mitigating climate change, because it stores so much carbon. It's 3 to 5 times than terrestrial forests. So if you avoid emission from this particular ecosystem, which is under a huge pressure and threat of development, you will win one of the side of the coin. And if you think about the role of this very fragile ecosystem in adapting with the changing climate, especially sea level rise, so you will kill two birds with one bullet in this particular ecosystem when you do it properly in terms of mitigating climate change, avoiding deforestation and mangrove degradation, and at the same time you improve or enhance the resilience, not only the ecosystem but also the community who live around this area and rely on the presence and sustainability of this ecosystem. And these people are the poorest of the poorest. So again, this is perhaps not the bonus, but the main thing if you handle a fragile ecosystem like mangrove in the context of development pathways. So think about this and the context of mitigation and adaptation. You can do two things in one go if the development of the coastal zone is designed properly. And think about the local and people who rely on this fishing community, for example, and those who can do only in the close near shore fishery. They cannot go far because of their capacity. And if you improve the situation in the coastal zone, you will be finding the situation where these people are going to be happy when you are doing development properly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Over to you, Thuy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ma, for putting a very well laid out slide on climate resilient development. And actually, the research that CIFOR carry out for the last 26 years illustrates quite well the slide that you mentioned about the interdisciplinary and also the complex system that you are working with. At CIFOR, then, we focus most of our research on addressing the drivers of deforestation and degradation, because deforestation is responsible for about 22% of global emission. So reduced emission from deforestation and degradation can significantly contribute to climate, but also resilience and also development as a whole. But as our global research have showing that the drivers of deforestation and degradation are most of the time quite rooted from the political economy, particularly on the socio-economic development pathway that the government agency to choose. And this actually is very complex to address because, as you said, it need to address both the economic priorities, the political priorities, as well as the national commitment on climate change goal. And sometimes it's not easy. But at the same time, we're also seeing that by failing to deliver action and also policies that addressing drivers of deforestation and degradation and also climate change, also showing the risk for the countries to obtain its long-term sustainable development goal. And I wanted to take a case study from Vietnam, because coffee production, Vietnam is the second largest coffee producers in the world, but also coffee is the main drivers of deforestation and degradation in Vietnam. So the government put up quite a large numbers of policy to protect forests, but at the same time, to maintain its competitive advantage in the global market, the Vietnamese government wanted to expand the coffee areas across Vietnam. So on the one hand, you don't deliver a sort of climate goal, but at the same time, you wanted to maintain the status in the global market. It actually also now coming back to the development pathway, because with high deforestation rate, particularly because of the conversion of the coffee, Vietnamese product and agriculture sector is now in the risk of continuing to keep up with the status in the global market, because its value chain are suffering in terms of high deforestation risk, and the consumer at the global level are not supporting that practice. So eventually it's going to affect our GDP if the government doesn't change the development pathway, which is looking at both climate change mitigation and adaptation and climate resilience. So I wanted to take a very concrete case study, but hopefully we can reflect on it with that concrete case study. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Thuy. Margaret?
Thank you, Mark. My name is Margaret. I'm from Namibia. I work in the context of rural development and adaptation. And what I'm familiar with, I see the linkages between rural development and adaptation. Because in Namibia, for instance, we have a rural development strategy, which is aligned to National Development Plan. And within the context of food security and livelihood, if you want to strengthen adaptive capacity of rural communities, the aspects that you are actually trying to strengthen are the similar aspects that the rural development policy is dealing with. And what I have seen in my experience lacking is that our national government is implementing the rural development strategy in isolation. And adaptation, it's going in a different direction as an international funded activity. So I understand that for Namibia to follow a climate resilient development pathway, for instance, we need to align adaptation with rural development, because 57% of the Namibian population is a rural population. And there's really a potential there. And what we have been doing in Namibia is to create capacity and awareness with political leaders and with sub-national decision makers, because they are the ones who prioritize rural development activities. So the linkages between the two is actually to choose, it's not really choosing, but to ensure that when you are implementing the rural development policy and strategy, which is already speaking to agriculture, smart agriculture, it's already speaking to providing services, improving skills, improving access to agricultural input, marketing information, and others. These are all rural development, which at the same time is also, I see the similarity between adaptation and rural development. So I would say our implementers and our policymakers just become deliberate that when they are implementing the rural development policy, they make it, they take a climate resilient pathway. For Namibia, we realize that there's quite a potential, but it will only happen if decision makers are deliberate about it and they are aware what are these nexus, what are the limits, and what are the potentials. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. And now over to you, Imelda.
Hello, everyone. Are you freezing as much as I'm freezing? Okay. So I don't want to take too much of your time. I agree with all my co-panelists. It reflects the experiences that we have in Southeast Asia. I speak from the point of view of policymakers from the Intergovernmental Organization of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, composed of 10 countries. So I'm coming from the sector of agri-food system, where we are looking at agriculture as both part of the problem with land use conversion and with greenhouse gas emission, but we're focusing on agriculture as part of the problem, but part of the solutions. So let's focus on the solutions. There's noise everywhere, there's freezing. It's so hard, but I'm glad I got your attention. So coming from the policy making, at the moment, please somebody mute Dr. Shelat. Coming from the policymaker's point of view, we are at this point in history where most of our governments have committed to higher climate ambitions. And we are at this point where we don't actually know what these commitments are for. What does net zero mean? So we are actually putting in a lot of technical support in understanding what is net zero, net neutrality, climate neutrality, etc. I know that we're focusing on adaptation here, but this is a side effect of a very highly emerging, uplift-going economy of Southeast Asia. So we are focusing on defining our pathways. We have successfully done a certain kind of visioning exercise of where the 10 countries wanted to go jointly together, and we are now defining pathways on it. Solutions, there's so many out there. We produce so many guidelines on climate-smart agriculture, climate-friendly, promotion of stress-tolerant rice varieties, climate information services, insurance for crops, integrated crop planning, alternate wetting and drying, of which Vietnam is leading the way, rice shrimp farming, low emissions livestock. There's a whole gamut of solutions for the climate emergency that we're facing. But right now, my climate emergency is this freezing room. So I hand it over back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Imelda. And I couldn't agree more with the freezing room. So I'd like now to open it up to the floor. So are there any questions? Are there any questions that you have for our panelists, both in person and online? Whilst you're pondering that, maybe get your thinking hats on, then I will just pose one more question, and I'll give a little preamble, if you like. So I think broadly at a globally aggregated level, achieving the Agenda for Sustainable Development along with making progress on climate change is broadly in agreement. But there are some clear issues, some clear tensions. You know, particularly you could highlight some of the issues around energy demand and the need to develop, for instance, and the carbon cost of that around agricultural development and water use in water-scarce environments. So progress in one area will not necessarily lead to progress in other areas. And distributional issues, therefore, are very difficult to overcome. Some would say impossible to overcome, and the assumptions of our universal wins, I think, I would argue, rarely stand up to scrutiny. So with that in mind, my question to the panelists, I won't come to all of you, so maybe if you're feeling particularly keen to respond, then let me know. But we must clearly balance the demands for emission reductions, to reduce exposure to climate change, to reduce the locked-in climate change that we want to avoid. We must balance adaptation to manage residual climate risks, so for the changes that are already locked into the climate system. And we must balance development to address existing vulnerability and enhance our capacity to develop in a way which is equitable and fair. So drawing on your own work and experience, how best do you think you could achieve this, given the examples and the introductions that you've highlighted already? So for instance, Santiago, you talked about trying to embed climate into the research activities that IDRC do. Thuy, you talked about the coffee issues. Danielle, you highlighted some of the issues and co-benefits with mangroves. And Imelda, you came up with a massive long list of things related to agriculture. And Margaret, you highlighted that rural development is sometimes separate from other key elements of climate resilient development. So given those examples, would anybody like to respond to how best they feel that we can balance those competing demands of adaptation, mitigation, and development? Okay, Santiago.
Yeah, I can try. And I want to shift a little bit because I think we have agendas that we have in the space of development that we can learn and bring to the conversation of the mitigation, adaptation, and risk management that you mentioned. I think is the way that, for instance, we have moved from the last decades into the integration of gender equity, gender transformative approaches to our programs. And I think an example is we were very good at doing gender integration in rural development. We were very good at starting doing gender integration in adaptation capacity. What if we move those approaches into elements and approaches on the new economies? And I think that's in a space where we can actually transform the most. And when we look about the low carbon and zero carbon future, that's going to develop a new way of doing development. The traditional women's economic empowerment programs are going to be more sustainable, inclusive economic processes. I think in that space is in a space where the transformation can be bigger because we are going to be managing risk that normally economic and new jobs, new opportunities, new investments are much better at risk. We are going to be able to do mitigation because it's going to be an economy that is going to be greener. It's going to be an economy that has to play in a planet of a zero carbon economy. And it's going to create new jobs. So suddenly it's going to have development outcomes that are going to have the impact in the most vulnerable communities. So I think that movement that we have seen give us a space on a new economy that needs to be different, and also that needs to be resilient to the different climate challenges that is going to be facing. So that will be the way I will transform a little bit the question, but probably other panelists can do a better job in the freezing space that we are.
I just want to add from the coastal zone point of view. So when the development pathway is likely going to be aquaculture development, that's very clear that mangrove will be one of the possible victims. And if we can do it properly, or even avoid to do it, then find another solution with regard to keeping the carbon storage there, and at the same time providing a better livelihood for local community. That's one of the options. If we are dealing with agriculture, it's the same thing. Usually you convert a coastal zone dominated by mangrove into something else. And now in Southeast Asia, we observe the conversion into oil palm, and not only aquaculture, but also rice agriculture in Myanmar and other places where it is possible. It's very strange because the ecosystem is very saline, but they invest money to remove the salinity or improve the salinity for the new crops. And if that kind of option can be avoided, instead of converting, we can also use the option like restoring and make use of the knowledge mainly owned or obtained by the local community to have it more sustainable. So aquaculture with mangrove can be combined, and there are a number of examples in Southeast Asia we observe that can be done. So that's one of the way we can inject development agenda, at the same time also enhancing the resilience of local community. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And I think one more contribution from the panel. So, Margaret, you've got your hand up. I'll go to Margaret.
Yeah, I'm just going to give a local level examples when we do our work with the lowest level of governance in Namibia. Once you explain the linkages between adaptation and rural development and explain what climate resilience development is, and then you ask in a participatory way for communities to come up with some vision. How do they want to see development in the area? There's one thing that comes out, which is core benefits. We ask them participatory, you can see it's core, but you can see that there are activities that they propose that are speaking to mitigation, and although their main aim is to develop its community development, mainly focusing on infrastructure like roads, housing, bigger markets, water reclamation plants, and then you see them putting solar panels. Instead of putting diesel tractors, they put something else. They put drip irrigation because they understand what you are talking about. Sometimes we undermine the local community's understanding of things. They understand you are talking about climate smart agriculture, although they won't call it climate smart agriculture. They understand you are talking about the core benefits between adaptation and mitigation and rural development. At the lowest level, the community has that understanding. At highest level, the national government of Namibia, they are highly encouraging that if adaptation does not have core benefits, then the government is not happy. They want us, when we are having funding, whether it's for mitigation or adaptation, they want to see what are the core benefits between land degradation and, let's say, climate smart agriculture. What are the core benefits between gender equality or women empowerment and, let's say, improve crop production. So I see that the best way is by looking at the core benefits and what are the best, what are the opportunities. When you look at the linkages between mitigation, adaptation, and development, what are the benefits or the opportunities in terms of the core benefits and synergies that are there, that you could potentially address while targeting adaptation. You are also achieving social development. While doing gender empowerment, you are also contributing to mitigation and adaptation strategy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll come to Thuy next, then to the audience. So get ready, and then we'll come back to the other panelists who haven't yet had a chance to contribute.
Thank you. I think that in order to address, the synergies and also the trade-off between climate resilience and also development, I think that based on our global research, then we do need a transformational change. And in here, the transformational change really referring to the shift in power, also in narrative, and also finance. And I think that right now, in different developing countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, the government agency always asks about, do you have any evidence that can really draw out a strong evidence for decision making? There is a potential for that. And apparently from a research perspective, surprisingly, even there is a large number of interventions, both policies and project level, you had a very limited, rigorous scientific evidence on the effectiveness, efficiencies, and the equitable distribution of benefit and outcome. And for those reasons, you don't provide any strong evidence even for the policies maker and also, the local people to driving the change. So that's the first thing. You need to change the narrative, and in order to change the narrative, you need a concrete scientific evidence and pointed out what worked, where, and how, and for whom. And I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that you also need to have a transformational change in the way that you are financing things. Because it doesn't make any sense if you're asking developing countries or local communities to protect forests, in our case, and not converting into coffee, while in fact the government give about 10 times higher subsidies for the coffee farmer and pay nothing for forest protection. So unless you're addressing that inequity and the imbalance between the financial incentive, you cannot motivate or incentivize any change. I think that the last one is also on the power dynamic, because I refer back to your earlier points about, like the short-term thinking, also about the competed values and interests from different stakeholders, because some might focus on conservation, the other one more on climate change, the other one on more development. But the problem is that if you're looking at the decision-making process, most of the time, the poor, the indigenous people who are vulnerable are not in part of the table for discussion. Their voice has not been heard. Their preferences are not integrated into the policies, and therefore you're falling into another problems of, governance failure, and therefore chasing on that. I think there is not, right now in the narrative in Asian countries is that you have to come with the cost of development if you wanted to do conservation or climate resilient. But in fact, the narrative has to be changed into a much more positive, kind of narrative, both in the law as well as in the debate, that it is possible and it's doable and it's actually a positive pathway that you can embrace. And I think that that's going to be the direction that we need to support for the policymaker and the practitioner on that angle. Thank you, Mark.
Super, thanks very much. So this is the final chance for the audience. That's fine, audience. Someone even left when I asked that question. That's how unwilling they were. Okay, so I think we've got about 10 minutes left. So my final question, and I'll come to you, Vishwanath, first, is just to think about what are the key research or knowledge to action gaps that we need to address to enable us to move forward in relation to climate resilient development. So where do you think are the key areas where we need to invest effort to help us make progress on climate resilient development? So over to you, Vishwanath.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. As I mentioned earlier, there are 3-4 very, very critical areas for action research on climate resilient agriculture. One of them could be vulnerability mapping index, working out for a major ecology or a medium ecology or a minor ecology, agroecology. That would give us a very clear idea about interventions, whether it is water management or carbon management or the production intervention management or the community participation. So one area is the vulnerability mapping at different levels. The second point, for a climate resilient action research could be how do we integrate different delivery mechanisms at the grassroots level. You have public sector delivery mechanism, you have a private sector delivery mechanism, farmer-driven mechanism, non-government organizations have their own pathways to deal with climate resilient issues. If we think of integrating or converging different efforts at a microecology, perhaps we may have better footprint to deal with climate action and climate resilient action. So Mark, these are the 2 points. One is indexing vulnerability, and other one is convergence of delivery mechanisms at the grassroots level. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll come to Imelda next.
Thank you so much. I need to go to the bathroom after this. I wanted to just say, I'm not going to answer it as a research idea, but what I wanted to say is some of the solutions lie with more public-private partnerships, the role of the private sector in actually doing the 3 pillars of climate-smart agriculture, which is lowering emissions, increasing adaptation, while at the same time increasing adaptive capacities, and increasing income. They have so much of a role to play because private sector wanted to lower their water use, lower their use of electricity, while at the same time increasing profit. So I think there's a lot of agri-innovation happening in the region with startups, and I think this is a really good way to focus on at the moment. Apart from the CGIR, the CG1 has covered the research, I think, and the universities. Thank you so much. And may I excuse myself because I need to go to the bathroom.
Please.
Bye, guys.
Please do. So from our remaining four panelists, are there any final thoughts that you would like to make in relation to key gaps, either in relation to research or in terms of knowledge to action?
I think people is in the central of this debate, and I think we should address the challenge around them, especially with those very vulnerable group of community. Thank you.
May I, one thing, and I don't know if it's a research gap, but it's something that we have to remember, that both crises, the climate crisis and the development crisis, the inequalities crisis that we are seeing, are the result of the same failure of the system that we had. So and both has provided us a planet that is at risk, and societies that are, and individuals that are at risk. And I think any research that doesn't understand that the system transformation that needs to happen, it will be missing, and it will be going to the, not to the source of the problem, but to the very minuscule elements of the problem. And I think that is not easy, but I think we have to pay attention when we design our research to not be afraid to have systematic approaches to the solutions that we have.
And then Margaret or Thuy?
I think that the other things on the data gap is that, I mean, sorry, one of the earlier panelists have said, is that in order to do dealing with both climate change and ecological and social change, you need to be adaptive. But of course, the adaptation pathway and how it's unfold, particularly in different political contexts and governance contexts, different capacity and different, like short-term and long-term priorities from different government agency. I don't think that we had a good understanding or even a lesson learned on how this complexity unfold in reality, so that you don't offer a uniform solution and asking developing countries or in Asian countries to follow a single pathway. In fact, might be a multiple pathway to achieve this, and we should not frame it as a fixed or very boxy solution, but how to unpack it into innovative and different pathway. I think that we still need to have a little bit of more data and research to address those gaps.
Thank you. Margaret?
Yeah, for me, I think, based from my own experience, I realize that sometimes when we engage, I engage sometimes with high level of decision makers. You get introduced them to that there's a need for us to follow the climate resilient development pathway. You explain what it is, but they still have questions. And I think research needs to focus on answering those questions. For instance, some of the politicians want to know, how much will this cost me? How will you know? So I think research really needs to focus on where is the country at? And to follow this climate resilient development pathway, what is the deficit? So whether it's an economist, whether it's a social scientist, whether it's a climate scientist, or whether it's interdisciplinary kind of research, we need to answer that question, because most of the time, I find myself where the decision maker says, yes, I'm willing to do this, but how much will it cost me? What is the deficit? Where should I prioritize? Where should the money go? So I think research need to answer those questions. And these are the information that we need to provide those that are in charge of the development agenda, whether it's for the country or whether it's at national level. I'm speaking from the country where things are centralized in many sectors. So it doesn't matter if you don't handle things at national level, at local level, things don't get moved because the country is centralized. So I would say research and assessments need to provide answers to those questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Rachel, Kirit, and Vishwanath online, and my hearty thanks to the panel. Just a small round of applause. And then we will now bring things to a close. For those in the audience, if you would like to get in touch with me or any members of the panel, scan the code, pop your details down there, and then the appropriate member of the panel, the presenters, will get back in touch with you in due course. Okay, so thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks all.